On the night of July 16, 1918, in a sweltering basement room in the Ural mountain town of Ekaterinburg, a former emperor of Russia was woken up just after midnight and told to get his family dressed. Nicholas Romanov, who had once ruled 1/6 of the world's land surface and commanded the largest standing army on Earth, carried his 13-year-old son down the stairs in his arms because the boy was too sick with hemophilia to walk. His wife followed, along with their 4 daughters, the family doctor, a cook, a valet, and a maid. They were led into a small whitewashed room with a single bare bulb and told to wait for a truck that was supposed to evacuate them to safety. 11 armed men walked in instead. Within 20 minutes, the family that had ruled Russia for 304 years was dead on the floor, and the executioners were already arguing about how to dispose of the bodies before sunrise. That is the ending almost everyone knows. The Romanovs went into a basement, and the Romanovs did not come out. But that ending raises a much bigger question, one that history textbooks tend to skip over in a single paragraph. How does a dynasty that survived Napoleon's invasion, the Crimean War, 2 assassination plots in a single decade, and a revolution in 1905 simply vanish in the span of 18 months? How does an empire stretching from Warsaw to Vladivostok, with over 170 million subjects and a sacred coronation ceremony dating back to medieval Muscovy, end with a few muffled gunshots in a merchant's basement in the middle of nowhere? And maybe the strangest question of all, where did the Romanovs actually go after that night? Because the answer is far more complicated than a single execution. The bodies were burned, soaked in acid, dumped in a mine shaft, dug back up, moved to a second site, and buried under railroad ties in a forest road for the next 73 years. Rumors of survivors spread across Europe almost immediately. Impostors claimed to be the missing daughters for decades. Scattered cousins fled across borders carrying jewelry sewn into their coats, ending up in Paris apartments, English country houses, and one even working as a riveter in an American shipyard during the Second World War. The empire that ruled Russia did not just collapse, it scattered. To understand where the Romanovs went, you have to understand where they came from, and the beginning of the dynasty is almost as strange as the end. In February of 1613, a 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov was hiding in a monastery north of Moscow with his mother when a delegation of Russian noblemen showed up at the gate and informed him that he had been elected Tsar of all the Russias. The boy reportedly burst into tears and tried to refuse. His mother screamed at the delegation that her son was too young, too inexperienced, and that taking the throne in 1613 was essentially a death sentence. She was not exaggerating. Russia at that moment was a ruined country. The previous 15 years had been called the Time of Troubles, a period so chaotic that historians still struggle to summarize it in a single chapter. The old ruling dynasty, the Rurikids, had ended in 1598 when Tsar Fedor I died without an heir. What followed was a nightmare of famine, civil war, peasant uprisings, Polish invasions, Swedish invasions, 3 different impostors claiming to be the dead son of Ivan the Terrible, and a brief period where a Polish prince actually sat on the Russian throne in the Kremlin. By the time the noblemen showed up at that monastery, roughly 1/3 of the Russian population was dead. Moscow had been burned, and the treasury was empty. The boyars, the great noble families of Russia, were desperate. They needed a Tsar who was connected enough to the old dynasty to be legitimate, but young enough and weak enough that they could control him. Mikhail Romanov was a perfect candidate on paper. His great-aunt had been the first wife of Ivan the Terrible. His father, Filaret, was a powerful Orthodox churchman, currently being held prisoner in Poland. And Mikhail himself was 16 years old, sickly, politically inexperienced, and famously timid. The boyars thought they had chosen a puppet. They were wrong. When Filaret returned from Polish captivity in 1619, he effectively co-ruled with his son and began rebuilding the Russian state with an iron grip. The Romanovs proved to be ruthless, capable, and almost preternaturally good at survival. Within 2 generations, they had crushed rebellions, expanded the borders, broken the power of the boyars, and produced one of the most transformative rulers in European history, a man who would drag Russia into the modern world by force. That man was Peter Alexeyevich Romanov, born in 1672, and from the moment he could walk, he was different from every Russian ruler who had come before him. While his predecessors had been content to sit in Moscow surrounded by Orthodox priests and brocaded boyars, Peter was obsessed with the outside world. He stood nearly 6 feet 8 inches tall in an age when the average European man was barely over 5 feet 5. He had a facial twitch that frightened diplomats. He drank prodigiously, worked obsessively, and personally executed rebellious soldiers with his own axe when the mood took him. He was, by every reasonable definition, a force of nature wearing a crown. In 1697, Peter did something no Russian Tsar had ever done. He left the country. He traveled across Europe in disguise, calling himself Peter Mikhailov, and worked for months as a common shipwright in the dockyards of Amsterdam. He wanted to learn how to build ships with his own hands. He visited factories, hospitals, anatomy theaters, mints, and weapons workshops. He attended lectures, dissected corpses, and pulled teeth from his own servants for practice because he had become fascinated with dentistry. When he returned to Russia, he came back with a vision so radical that most of his nobility thought he had gone insane. He was going to make Russia European, whether Russia wanted it or not. He ordered the boyars to shave their beards, taxing those who refused. He banned the long traditional robes of the Russian aristocracy and required Western-style coats. He built a new capital, St. Petersburg, from scratch on a frozen swamp at the edge of the Baltic Sea, conscripting tens of thousands of peasants to drive pilings into the mud. Roughly 30,000 of them died in the construction. He fought a 21-year war against Sweden, then the dominant military power in Northern Europe, and won. He created a navy where none had existed. He reorganized the army on Prussian lines. He reformed the calendar, the alphabet, the tax code, the church, and the education system, all in the span of a single reign. By the time Peter died in 1725, Russia was no longer backwater. It was an empire, officially proclaimed, with a seat at the table of European great powers. And the Romanovs had transformed from a compromise candidate plucked out of a monastery into one of the most powerful ruling families in the world. But Peter left behind a problem that would haunt the dynasty for the next century. He had killed his own son. In 1718, Peter had his eldest boy Alexei tortured to death in the Peter and Paul fortress for allegedly plotting against him. The official cause of death was listed as apoplexy, but everyone in St. Petersburg knew the truth. The blows had been delivered in a cellar with the Tsar himself reportedly present. With Alexei gone, Peter then issued a new law of succession, declaring that the reigning monarch could simply name whoever they wanted as their heir, breaking with centuries of male primogeniture. He died in 1725 without naming anyone at all, and the result was 37 years of palace chaos that nearly destroyed everything he had built. 6 different monarchs sat on the Russian throne between 1725 and 1762. There was Peter's widow Catherine I, a former Lithuanian peasant girl who had once been a laundress. There was a 12-year-old grandson who died of smallpox before he could rule. There was Anna, a niece who ruled through a hated German favorite and ran the empire from a court so corrupt that historians struggle to describe it without resorting to profanity. There was a baby Tsar named Ivan VI who was overthrown in his crib and spent the rest of his life as a prisoner in a fortress, eventually murdered by his guards. There was Peter's daughter Elizabeth, who seized the throne in a midnight coup at the age of 32 and ruled for 20 years in a quarter wash in jewels, French fashion, and roughly 15,000 dresses catalogued in her wardrobe after her death. And then came the most improbable Romanov of all, a woman who was not actually a Romanov at all. Her name was Sophie Friederike August, a minor German princess from a small principality called Anhalt-Zerbst. She arrived in Russia at the age of 14, brought in as a bride for the heir to the throne, Elizabeth's nephew, a small, ugly, alcoholic young man named Peter who liked playing with toy soldiers and openly despised everything Russian. Sophie converted to Orthodoxy, took the name Catherine, learned to speak fluent Russian, and quietly began studying the politics of her adopted country. She married Peter in 1745 in a wedding she later described as the most miserable day of her life. The marriage was a disaster. The empire would soon be hers anyway. When Empress Elizabeth died in December of 1761, Catherine's husband became Tsar Peter III. He lasted 6 months. In that half-year, he managed to insult the army by trading away hard-won territorial gains, alienate the Orthodox Church by openly mocking its rituals, and humiliate his wife by parading his mistress in front of the entire court. Catherine had spent 18 years preparing for exactly this moment. She had learned the language, courted the nobility, befriended the officers of the elite guard regiments, and taken a series of carefully chosen lovers from inside the military establishment. On the morning of July 9th, 1762, she put on a guards officer's uniform, mounted a white horse named Brilliant, and led the Izmailovsky regiment in a bloodless coup against her own husband. Peter III signed his abdication within hours. 8 days later, he was dead, strangled in a country estate by men loyal to Catherine's lover Alexei Orlov. The official cause of death was a hemorrhoidal attack. Nobody in Europe believed it. Catherine ruled for the next 34 years, and she ruled with a brilliance that would earn her the title Catherine the Great. She corresponded with Voltaire, patronized the arts, founded hospitals, established schools for noble girls, expanded the empire by nearly 200,000 square miles, partitioned Poland out of existence in cooperation with Prussia and Austria, and pushed Russian borders to the Black Sea after a series of crushing wars against the Ottoman Empire. She took an estimated 22 official lovers across her reign, showering each with estates, serfs, and titles when she dismissed them. She built the Hermitage. She bought entire European art collections. She made St. Petersburg one of the most glittering capitals in the world. But underneath the glamour, the dynasty was rotting from within. Catherine despised her son, Paul, blaming him for reminding her of the husband she had murdered. She kept him isolated from power for decades, raising her grandson Alexander as her chosen successor instead. When she died of a stroke in 1796, Paul rushed into her private rooms and reportedly burned every document he could find that might have disinherited him. He took the throne at the age of 42, embittered, paranoid, and convinced that everyone around him was a traitor. Within 5 years, he would be dead in his own bedroom, killed by his own officers, with his son's reluctant consent. The night of March 23, 1801, a group of drunken officers climbed the staircase of the St. Michael's Castle in St. Petersburg and broke down the door of the Tsar's private chamber. Paul tried to hide behind a fire screen. They dragged him out, demanded his abdication, and when he hesitated, struck him in the temple with a heavy gold snuff-box. Then they strangled him with a silk scarf. Down the hall, his 23-year-old son, Alexander, waited, having been told the conspirators would only force his father into retirement. When an officer entered to inform him that his father was dead, Alexander reportedly collapsed in tears, repeating that he had not wanted this, that he had been promised no harm would come. He carried the guilt for the rest of his life. Alexander would become one of the most enigmatic Romanovs in history. He was the Tsar who faced Napoleon Bonaparte, lost catastrophic battles at Austerlitz and Friedland, signed a humiliating peace at Tilsit on a raft in the middle of a river, and then, 4 years later, watched the Grand Armée burn its way across western Russia in the summer of 1812. 600,000 soldiers, the largest invasion force Europe had ever seen, marched on Moscow. Alexander refused to negotiate. He ordered the city evacuated and burned to deny Napoleon supplies. By the time the French army retreated through a Russian winter, only about 20,000 were left alive. The empire that had nearly collapsed in his father's reign was suddenly the dominant land power on the European continent. Alexander rode into Paris at the head of an Allied army in 1814, was hailed as the savior of Europe, and presided over the Congress of Vienna that redrew the map of the continent. Then, in 1825, he traveled to a remote town on the Sea of Azov called Taganrog and died there suddenly at the age of 47, supposedly of typhus. The body brought back to St. Petersburg in a sealed coffin was reportedly unrecognizable. Within years, rumors spread that Alexander had not died at all, that he had faked his own death and escaped to Siberia to live as a hermit and monk under the name Fyodor Kuzmich. The rumor was never confirmed and never quite died. It is still debated by Russian historians today. What is certain is that his death triggered another succession crisis, and that crisis would shape the next century. Alexander had no legitimate children. The throne should have passed to his next brother Constantine, but Constantine had secretly renounced his rights years earlier to marry a Polish countess. The renunciation had been kept private, locked in a sealed envelope in a Moscow cathedral. When Alexander died, almost nobody outside the immediate family knew about it. For nearly 3 weeks in December of 1825, the army swore allegiance to Constantine, while Constantine, sitting in Warsaw, kept insisting that the throne belonged to his younger brother Nicholas. Nicholas, in St. Petersburg, kept insisting it belonged to Constantine. The empire briefly had 2 czars, and effectively none at the same time. A group of reformist officers, many of them veterans who had marched into Paris a decade earlier and seen what constitutional government looked like in the West, decided to exploit the confusion. On December 26, 1825, roughly 3,000 soldiers refused to swear allegiance to Nicholas and gathered in Senate Square. They demanded a constitution. Nicholas, 29 years old and untested, ordered artillery brought up and grape shot fired directly into the formation. The Decembrists were crushed in a single afternoon. 5 leaders were hanged, the rest exiled to Siberia. Nicholas I had taken the throne in blood, and he would rule for the next 30 years as one of the most rigid autocrats in European history, a Tsar nicknamed the Iron Emperor, who believed his sole task was to hold the line against the chaos of the modern age. That line eventually broke. Nicholas I died in 1855 during the Crimean War, watching his army get torn apart by British and French forces using rifled muskets and steam-powered warships against a Russian military, still equipped largely the way it had been under Catherine the Great. His son Alexander II inherited a humiliating defeat and made a remarkable decision. He chose to reform. In 1861, he signed the Emancipation Edict, freeing 23 million Russian serfs in a single stroke, the largest legal liberation of human beings in history up to that point. He reformed the courts, the army, local government, and education. He sold Alaska to the United States for $7 million. He survived 4 assassination attempts. The 5th attempt, on March 13, 1881, killed him. A revolutionary named Ignacy Ekaterinburg threw a bomb at his feet on a St. Petersburg street. Alexander died on a couch in the Winter Palace, as his 13-year-old grandson Nicholas watched from the doorway. That 13-year-old grandson would one day become Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia. But before he did, his father Alexander III spent 13 years on the throne doing everything in his power to undo his own father's reforms. Alexander III was enormous, physically imposing, and famously strong. He could allegedly bend iron pokers with his hands and once held up a collapsing railway car roof during a derailment to allow his family to escape. He believed reform had killed his father, and he intended to make sure it killed no one else. He cracked down on press freedom, restricted university autonomy, persecuted religious minorities, and launched the brutal pogroms that drove millions of Jews out of the Russian Empire in the 1880s and 1890s. He kept the country quiet through sheer force of personality and police power. And then, in 1894, at the age of 49, he died of kidney disease, leaving the throne to his unprepared, gentle, and almost painfully ordinary son. Nicholas II was 26 years old when he became Tsar. He had been raised in an isolated bubble of imperial luxury, given a military education focused on uniforms and parades, and shielded from the actual mechanics of government. He famously told a friend, on the day of his father's death, that he was not ready to be Tsar, that he knew nothing about the work of governing, and that he had no idea what to do. He never really figured it out. He was a devoted family man, a loving husband, an affectionate father, and one of the worst rulers of a major empire in modern history. He married a German princess named Alex of Hesse, who took the name Alexandra and converted to Russian Orthodoxy with the intensity of a recent convert. They were genuinely, almost embarrassingly in love. They had 4 daughters in a row: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and then in 1904 they finally had a son named Alex. Within weeks of his birth, the parents discovered the boy had hemophilia, a blood disorder inherited through Alexandra's family from her grandmother Queen Victoria. Any small cut or bruise could kill him. The illness was kept a state secret, and in the years that followed, Alexandra grew increasingly desperate, increasingly mystical, and increasingly dependent on a strange Siberian peasant who claimed he could heal her son through prayer. His name was Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a wandering holy man with piercing eyes, an unkempt beard, and a reputation for both miraculous healing and spectacular debauchery. Whether he had any genuine ability or simply benefited from coincidence, the bleeding episodes of the young heir reliably improved when Rasputin was nearby. Alexandra became convinced he was a saint sent by God. By 1915, with Nicholas away at the front commanding the Russian armies in the First World War, Alexandra was effectively running the home government, and Rasputin was effectively advising her. Ministers were appointed and dismissed at his suggestion. The political class watched in horror. In December of 1916, a group of aristocrats led by Prince Felix Yusupov lured Rasputin to a basement, fed him cyanide-laced cakes and wine, shot him repeatedly when the poison failed to work, and finally dumped his body through a hole in the ice of the Neva River. He was dead. The damage to the dynasty was not. By early 1917, Russia was disintegrating. The war had killed nearly 2 million Russian soldiers. Cities were starving. Red lines stretched for blocks in Petrograd, the renamed St. Petersburg. On March 8th, women textile workers walked off the job demanding food. Within days, the strike had spread across the city. Soldiers ordered to fire on the protesters began joining them instead. On March 15th, after his own generals informed him that the army would no longer defend his crown, Nicholas signed an abdication document in a railway car parked at the Pskov station. He abdicated not only for himself, but also for his hemophiliac son Alexei, passing the throne to his brother Michael. Michael refused to take it. 304 years of Romanov rule ended in roughly 48 hours, with a signature in pencil on a train. The family was placed under house arrest at their palace outside Petrograd. Then they were moved east, to the Siberian town of Tobolsk, and finally to Ekaterinburg in the spring of 1918, where they were housed in a confiscated merchant's mansion that the Bolsheviks renamed the House of Special Purpose. The windows were whitewashed shut. The family read books, played cards, performed amateur theatricals, and waited. They sewed jewels into the corsets of the daughters' dresses in case of an escape attempt that never came. By July, with anti-Bolshevik armies closing in on the city from the east, the local Soviet decided the prisoners could not be allowed to be rescued. The order came down from Moscow on July 16th, transmitted through coded telegrams that still survive in the archives. Just after midnight, the family was woken, dressed, and led downstairs. The execution took roughly 20 minutes, partly because the jewels sewn into the corsets of the daughters deflected the first volley of bullets, and the executioners had to finish the work with bayonets and revolver shots at point-blank range. The bodies were loaded onto a truck, driven into the Koptyaki forest, stripped, mutilated, doused in sulfuric acid, burned with gasoline, and buried in 2 separate grave sites under a road. The location was kept secret for the next 73 years, but the story did not end at that pit. Within months, rumors spread across Europe that one of the daughters had survived. The most famous claimant was a young woman pulled from a Berlin canal in 1920, who later took the name Anna Anderson and insisted, for the rest of her long life, that she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia. She fooled some surviving Romanov relatives, was rejected by others, and inspired decades of films, novels, and lawsuits. DNA testing after her death in 1984 finally proved she was a Polish factory worker named Franciszka Szankowska. She was one of at least 10 women across the 20th century who claimed to be Anastasia, and none of them were. The real remains were finally located in 1991 by an amateur historian who had been quietly searching for them since the Soviet era. 2 of the bodies, including Alexei's, were missing from the main grave, and were not discovered until 2007 in a second smaller pit nearby. DNA testing confirmed the identities. In 1998, 80 years after the murders, the family was reburied in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg in the same crypt as their ancestors, the dynasty finally home. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized them as saints. The wider family had scattered across the globe. Nicholas's mother, Maria Fedorovna, escaped on a British warship and lived out her days in Denmark. Cousins ended up in Paris, London, New York, and Buenos Aires. Today, the descendants of those exiles still hold occasional reunions, still debate among themselves who would be the rightful heir if Russia ever restored its monarchy. The empire is gone. The bloodline is not. If this kind of historical breakdown grabs you, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. There are a lot more empires left to dig into, and the stories only get stranger from here.